Greetings from Washington, D.C. This is Khalil Jahshan from Arab Center, Washington, D.C. Welcome to today's webinar entitled China's Growing Role in the Middle East, Regional Geopolitics and U.S. Policy. China has been the talk of the day in recent weeks and recent months, whether in the Middle East or here in Washington and other Western capitals for clear reasons in terms of both the growing role of China in the region and changing geopolitics in the region. We all know that China has traditionally avoided pursuing a rather assertive or dominant security presence in the Middle East in its foreign policy strategy, primarily due to its own long-term assessment of the region's political instability. It did not want to be involved maybe in all kinds of problematic conflicts, and due to its unique approach and emphasis instead on the pursuit of Chinese global economic ambitions. In the last few years, however, China has been gradually but steadily stepping up its investments in the Middle East and Africa, the MENA region, not only in terms of economic development, but also to some limited extent in arms trade and security engagements, technological and urban infrastructures, and most recently and importantly, even trying to dabble in diplomatic efforts and conflict mediation in the region. Mind you, that involvement, particularly in the matter of arms trade, is rather quite limited. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, it's only like 5% of the trade in the region compared, for example, to the massive US involvement in about 54% of arms trade in the region. But I would say that the most prominent recent power play came when Beijing brokered a Saudi-Iran agreement in March of this year, which put it on the political map in the MENA region and became, as I said, the talk of the day in the region. It did surprise the US and other great powers. Whether it's exaggerated or not, we will be discussing that today. What needs to be done US-wise will also be discussed today. But Chinese officials have also expressed, as I said, recent even fleeting hints in mediating the Arab-Israeli conflict, hosting President Abbas of Palestine, upping their interactions with Israel, talking about Ukraine, and participating in meetings in the region with regards to a solution, to the potential solution to the war in Ukraine, and alluding to even plans for renewing the Iran nuclear deal, which seems to have reached a stalemate in terms of direct US-EU-Iran negotiations. At any rate, Arab Center has not been immune to this talk of the day. We have actually, back in May 18, to be exact, we held a conference on the whole topic of US pivoting away from the Middle East, fact or fiction. And to mention that, I just wanted to remind you that a book is coming out in 2 to 3 weeks called A US Pivot Away from the Middle East, Fact or Fiction, based on that conference and some additional chapters. Here is the cover of that book. So keep track of our website, visit our website at arabcenterdc.org. If you could add /pivot to that, and you will see the maybe the form to try to obtain a copy of that. I think it's an excellent volume that you will enjoy. So Arab Center is convening this panel today, a panel of great experts to discuss China's evolving foreign policy and its growing engagements in the MENA region, their implications for regional geopolitics and the global political order, and particularly in terms of US policy and its influence. Talking to kind of decision makers on both sides of the Atlantic, it's interesting to what extent this issue bothers them. US decision makers tell you how puzzled they are at Arabs thinking that the US has pivoted away and vice versa. People in the region not only are upset and wondering about why the US has left them alone, not necessarily that it has disappeared from the region, but that they feel its commitments to the region are not necessarily being honored readily or as expected. Many questions have arisen over the past few months with regards to this issue. What is the scale and scope of China's role and influence in the Middle East? Is this a new era of Chinese foreign policy and regional primacy? What are Middle East states' strategy and priorities in this regard? Personally, I've been saying, is the U.S. really pivoting from the region, or is the region pivoting away from the U.S.? Is China pursuing a new foreign policy strategy to assert and expand its influence in the region? Will China succeed in presenting itself as an alternative to the Western model, particularly for the U.S. role as a leading or dominant external power in the region, or is that somewhat exaggerated? Can China play a more forceful diplomatic role in the region, particularly with regards to peacemaking and reconciliation? Is it really interested in that? It hasn't been in the past, but is there a change there? What are the implications for great power competition between US, Russia, China, and so on? And how is the China-US rivalry affecting US commitments to an issue, of course, central to the agenda of Arab Center, which is human rights and democracy in the region, knowing that China as foreign policy is not necessarily as focused. Of course, there are doubts about US commitments on this issue too, but what is happening in the arena of human rights and democracy as a result of this competition? And finally, what recommendations can be made for US policy in the Middle East in light of all these events and developments? To start with, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Ambassador Chaz Freeman, an American diplomat and writer who has been observing, writing, commenting, and participating in the making of US foreign policy for quite a few years. He's a retired career diplomat who served as Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs back in the early 90s, 93 to 94, earning the highest public service awards from the Department of Defense, particularly in his role in the designing of a NATO-centered post-Cold War European security system and reestablishing defense and military relations with China. He served as US Ambassador to Saudi Arabia. Ambassador Freeman also worked as Deputy Chief of Mission and Chargé d'Affaires in the American embassies in Bangkok, Beijing. He was the Director of Chinese Affairs at the US Department of State in the late 70s and early 80s. He even, probably very interesting historically, was the principal American interpreter during the late President Nixon's path-breaking visit to China in 1972. With that in mind, a full resume is available online for those interested in more about the impressive career of Ambassador Freeman. But I would like to pass the microphone on to the ambassador at this time to give us his introductory remarks to our discussion today. He has 10 to 12 minutes. Ambassador Freeman, thank you so much.
Thank you, Khalil. That was a great introduction of the topic. The American obsession with the rising China has become nothing short of monomaniacal, diverting needed attention from almost all other foreign policy concerns. An escalating US forever war with Russia is underway in Europe. The China mainland and Taiwan are drifting toward renewed combat, this time with American involvement in their unfinished civil war. With help from Russia, North Korea is enhancing its ability to hold the United States at nuclear bay. Electoral autocracies are taking root in India and Israel. Military dictatorships are replacing democracies and French dominance in the Sahel. Parts of Libya, Syria, and Yemen remain in states of anarchy. Iran is breaking free of the maximum pressure the United States has applied to it. The Israel-Palestine issue is once again erupting in violence. Much of the world is searching for alternatives to the dollar as a medium of trade settlement. Yet our Secretary of State finds time to look for Chinese influence to root out in mid-Pacific mini-states. And here we are at the Arab Center addressing the Washington Beltway idée fixe du jour, China's increasing engagement with the countries of West Asia. The relentless American focus on China obscures the reality that over the past 3 decades, every country in the Middle East, including Egypt, Iran, Iraq, Israel, and the 6 members of the Gulf Cooperation Council, or GCC, has pivoted toward intensified economic and military relationships with Asia, not just China, but India, Indonesia, Japan, Korea, Malaysia, and Singapore. To be sure, trade with China by the region's largest economy, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, is now triple that with the United States and almost twice that with Europe. Today, about 1/5 of Gulf Arab international economic interaction is with China. But GCC trade turnover with India has recently grown far faster than that with China, rising by an amazing 58% between 2021 and 2022. The region's commercial relations with ASEAN are growing too, although nowhere near as rapidly. Investment flows are following a similar but delayed trajectory. The importance of the GCC countries in international finance is large and rising. The region is home to some of the world's largest sovereign wealth funds, with more than $3.7 trillion in total assets under management, an amount that exceeds the UK's 2022 GDP. Saudi Arabia expects that its main state investment vehicle, the Public Investment Fund, will have more than $2 trillion by 2030, making it the world's largest. The GCC's fund managers remain far more familiar and comfortable with European and American financial institutions, but their co-investment programs with Chinese development banks, funds, and the Chinese Investment Corporation, a counterpart sovereign wealth fund with assets of $1.3 trillion, are all expanding apace. Clearly, emerging Asia, with China in the lead, is displacing Western commercial influence in West Asia. American egocentrism is such that we assume that doing so must have been the Chinese objective. But there's no evidence whatsoever that this was the case. No government in the region expects China to replace the United States as a guarantor of its security. China has an aversion to alliances, which it regards as likely to involve it in quarrels in which it has no direct stake. And the Chinese saying, "Qianglong nanya di tou shu," even the strongest dragon would have trouble subduing a snake on its home ground, encapsulates Chinese skepticism about the risks inherent in projecting military power to distant environments. But the facts that China and India alone account for over half the world's economic growth, and that ASEAN's GDP is even larger than India's, have not escaped attention in West Asian capitals, which are actively negotiating free trade agreements with China, India, ASEAN, and ASEAN's member states. If these negotiations bear fruit, economists project that trade between the GCC and emerging Asia will grow about 6% per year to about $600 billion by 2030. Qatar's recent commitment to supply China with LNG through the year 2050 is a noteworthy illustration of what is happening. The United States, by contrast, no longer seems interested in lowering tariff or other trade and investment barriers with any foreign country. West Asia is no exception. It's easy to forget that it was Washington, not Beijing, that first embraced the imperative of Sino-American global competition and launched tariff and technology wars designed to hamstring its proclaimed rival's economy. In the name of such competition, the United States has done its best to restrict Chinese trade and investment in other countries and has imposed ever more sanctions, quotas, and tariff increases on the world, including on West Asia. But erecting such barriers to trade is no way to compete with agreements that facilitate and increase it. It just creates a vacuum that invites greater economic interaction between other countries, including China, as opposed to with America. As trends in West Asia illustrate, this is the recipe for reduced American influence. Meanwhile, China's Belt and Road Initiative and a variety of bilaterally agreed Sino-Arab funds are increasing connectivity between China and the Persian Gulf region. Not to be outdone, India and Russia are collaborating to link Moscow with Bombay through the Iranian port of Chabahar. There's been a lot of American talk about infrastructure investment, but nothing concrete has yet come of it. Blather has never been much of a substitute for hard cash. Politically, unlike the United States, which has cooperative relations with some West Asian nations and antagonistic relations with others, China has pursued a policy of friendship and economic intercourse with all. Of course, as the Chinese phrase has it, Guangjiao Wu Shanjiao, in practice, friendship with all means devotion to none. China is an important interlocutor, not a patron or ally of any West Asian state. It doesn't threaten any nation in the region, but it has carefully avoided assuming any commitment to defend one. China's aversion to alliances, as well as its inability to project power to the region, mean that it is not in contention to replace the United States as the guarantor of regional security. But it is beginning to develop military relationships with the countries of West Asia. After decades of near total dependence on international arms imports, both Saudi Arabia and the UAE now seek to attract investments in their nascent domestic military industries. The UAE has bought jet trainers and armed drones, as well as alleged military port construction services from China. Abu Dhabi's growing military relationship with Beijing was a key factor in queering the purchase of US F-35s it had been promised in return for its normalization of relations with Israel under the so-called Abraham Accords. The gradual emergence of China as a source of advanced weaponry and military technology is, in my view, a potential death blow to the traditional American approach of insisting that protected Arab states not buy US competitors' weapons, while Washington simultaneously refuses to sell them US alternatives. Saudi Arabia accounts for about 10% of the global arms market. Chinese sales to it have included ballistic missiles, armed drones, anti-drone systems, and artillery. Both the Kingdom and the Emirates, as well as Iran, now routinely exercise with the People's Liberation Army Navy. And this month, the UAE Air Force will join its first exercise with the PLA Air Force in Xinjiang. The only country in West Asia that has bowed to US pressure to limit military cooperation with China is Israel, which cannot afford to lose US backing for its so-called qualitative military edge. The US technology war on China is curtailing the previously robust presence of Chinese investors in Israeli startups. Israel has instead turned to India, whose lapse into Hindutva echoes its own religious nationalism and Islamophobia. The only country in West Asia that has bowed to US pressure is Israel. The US technology war, as I said, is curtailing the Israeli relationship with China. India is now Israel's primary military partner in emerging Asia and Israel's largest overseas arms market. Let me conclude so that the excellent panel, the Arab Center, is assembled to discuss the changing geopolitics of the Middle East can get to work. It's not all about us. The trends that Americans find disturbing in West Asia are less the product of predatory Chinese policies than they are the result of American unwillingness or inability to satisfy the economic, political, and military requirements of former client states in the region. China bashing, sanctions, and refusals to sell weapons or transfer technology will not retard still less reverse these trends. The region is pivoting toward emerging Asia, not just China. If Americans wish to contest this, we will have to adjust our policies and rules of engagement, not just with West Asian countries, but with the nations to their south and east. Thank you. That concludes my remarks.
Thank you, Ambassador Freeman. I forgot to ask you at the beginning, are you staying with us for the duration of the panel, or would you like to take a couple of questions at this time if you're leaving early?
I'll try to stick around, Khalil, as long as I can. I can't say how long that will be.
Okay. Let me then go ahead and just ask you one more question, in addition to your excellent presentation. If you could highlight for us your assessment of the current U.S.-Saudi relationship. I mean, considering the fact that the relationship recently has been somewhat rocky, starting particularly with the beginning of this administration. And now all this talk about normalizing with Israel as if it's central to all this stuff. Is it really central to all this stuff? And why is the administration's emphasis right now on a potential deal with Saudi Arabia not focusing on bilateral? I mean, the relationship itself is important to the U.S. It's central to our national interest, as everybody knows. But it is being turned into some kind of like a 2024 campaign ad for the benefits to Israel instead of the benefit to the U.S. and to Saudi Arabia. Would you care to comment on that?
I actually gave a comprehensive 40-minute lecture touching on all of these issues just on Sunday, I believe. And it's available on my website, which is Chas Freeman, CHASFRWMAN.net, and for anybody who wants to look at it. I think the relationship with Saudi Arabia, which was reflected idiotic commitment by our now President Biden when he was a candidate to turn the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and the relation and Saudi Arabia itself into pariahs. This was a very bad way to start. And he subsequently discovered that we had to have a cordial relationship with Saudi Arabia for reasons of our own national interest. And he pursued the Saudis vigorously to no real avail. More recently, the relationship has become more cordial, reflecting the president's desire for campaign contributions from armchair Zionists in the United States. That is to say, appeals to the Israel lobby by focusing on the possibility of normalizing Saudi relations with Israel. And my understanding is that the Crown Prince, who is the de facto decision maker, although his father, the king, has strong views on this subject, has said that this is premature. But the Saudis have responded. I think the analogy is, Khalil, I don't know if you have an old car, let's say a Volkswagen from the 1950s, before they had gas gauges, when you had to put a dipper in to find out how much gas was in the tank. If somebody came along and said they wanted to buy this car that you were very, very fond of, if you were behaving like the Saudis, you might say, well, I'll consider it for $1 million. In other words, you set a price that's so high, you know nobody's going to take it, or you think nobody's going to take it. So what the Saudis have asked for is a defense treaty, a U.S. defense commitment to Saudi Arabia, a nuclear industry, the end of settlement activity by Israel, and a variety of other things. By the way, the U.S. in these negotiations has added a requirement that Saudi Arabia stop courting China, which isn't going to get anywhere. So I think this is largely an electorally induced pipe dream by the White House. And I'd be very surprised if anything concrete comes of it. On the other hand, Saudi Arabia is quite prepared to deal transactionally with Israel when it's to its advantage. This is now the pattern in the region, one of realpolitik, and an ability to differentiate between what's important and what isn't, to set priorities, to cooperate on some matters and to oppose on others. And the fact that the United States is pushing this idea of normalization with Israel at the very moment that the most racist and oppressive government in Israeli history has taken power, and at a moment when the so-called Abraham Accords are largely in suspense at the government level, although transactions continue at the private sector level between UAE and Bahrain and Israel. This is very strange, and it is to be explained, I think, entirely in terms of American electoral considerations.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Freeman. I hope you could stay with us for the duration of the panel. If you could, we would appreciate that. Let me now move to the next speaker on this panel, my colleague and friend, Patricia Karam, who's joining us from Beirut today. She's a non-resident fellow at Arab Center, Washington, D.C. She has actually written in recent months some policy papers on some of these issues, and she will be focusing her remarks today on China's current approach, the evolving foreign policy and priorities in the MENA region in the context of great power competition and rivalry with the United States. Patricia, the next 10 to 12 minutes are yours.
Thank you, Khalil, and thank you, Arab Center, for inviting me to be part of this distinguished panel. I will make about 10 points, Khalil, and I will try to be brief. Yes, you mentioned great power competition and rivalry. I do think that China's approach and evolving strategy in the region has to be seen in the context of great power competition and rivalry with the US in particular, which now, as the ambassador pointed out, while it's keeping some important investments in the region, it has been seen as disengaging. And ironically, it's this narrative about the rebalance to Asia, what I guess the ambassador called the monomaniacal obsession with China, that really has increased the relevance of China to the US and decreased the relevance of the Middle East, ironically enough. And again, I would argue that China, within this great power competition and really the vacuum that's occasioned by the US retreat, has chiefly sought to stabilize the region and protect its interests and access to oil. In particular, the Middle East is really becoming the cornerstone of the Belt and Road Initiative, this massive sort of infrastructure project that's a mix of development and investment initiatives linking East Asia to the rest of the world. And again, as the ambassador mentioned, at base, this development strategy really wants to improve regional connectivity and cooperation through the creation of free trade zone and accelerate trade and investment by creating new export markets for China, all for sustainable growth. But to give you a sense of scope, it originally involved 64 countries, but its scope has now broadened to around 100. And it's really come to symbolize maybe the more dramatic expression of Chinese influence. Let's talk also about oil for a second. China's own fast economic growth has really come with a rising demand for oil. And China is now the region's main oil importer. Almost half of its imports come from the Middle East. But though oil really remains at the core of China's interest in the region, these really, again, as I mentioned, have broadened to encompass investment and trade. And China has become also the Gulf's main investor and trading partner. And this is, again, in the context of a declining US Gulf trade. So there are enormous stakes in this partnership, and they're growing exponentially. The Middle East, just as a sidebar, accounts for more than a quarter of the PRC's investments. At the same time, we know that the PRC is really establishing bilateral economic and strategic partnerships with many countries in the region, creating these webs of alliances, strategic cooperation agreements that were signed with Iran, for example, the most prominent of them, as well as rivals, including Saudi, the UAE, Oman, Bahrain, Kuwait, Egypt, and others in a range of critical areas, including energy, technology, telecom, infrastructure. And these really come with no strings attached, making them really enticing for leaders in the region who really do not want to be accountable for internal government. So it's also notable that China's engagement has really been guided by this principle of non-interference in domestic affairs, making sure not to unsettle any prevailing cultural or social norms, nor the prevailing patriarchal political systems. So China's economic moves may be signaling a more aggressive form of diplomacy, just like with the China brokered Iran-Saudi deal, which created all the hubbub. And if you look a bit more closely, China has been a bit less timid about military engagement in the Middle East. Since it acquired the Djibouti regional base in 2017, it has expanded its naval footprint. And incidentally, the Djibouti base has turned more into a military support facility from a logistics facility, and it's now looking for new bases, in particular in the Persian Gulf, like the Khalifa port in the UAE, where China is believed to be building a more permanent military presence as part of efforts to create like a broader network of military bases and logistical support sites. Now, China has also increased its soft power engagement in the region through this international media network, cultural centers, educational investments. And surveys, interestingly enough, indicate that views of China tend to remain positive, and there appears to be an openness toward China by those living in the region. One can say that it really has very little negative press, really perhaps having stayed out of conflict and stayed out of domestic affairs. And it is increasingly perceived as a stabilizing force. But I believe that it's bound to become more conspicuous as it expands influence in the region. Hence, the question becomes not if it will replace the US, but how it is becoming a welcome player in a region really looking to diversify its patrons. And we can discuss this more in the Q&A. So in some ways, the Middle East in this instance needs to be seen less from the vantage point of a region that's conquered by China, or potentially, let's say, conquered by China, but one that's really fundamentally displeased with the terms of its arrangement with the US and is looking to diversify its patrons, and having perceived the US to have, if not taken it for granted, but abandoned it. So in conclusion, I want to say that in the context of an end to US supremacy in the Middle East, there is a contest between powers who are demarcating their roles, and China is not the only one, but China specifically is playing the long game by trying to ensure a cheap flow of oil, home and goods to new markets in the region, and hoping that economic influence eventually translates into greater political and military influence, at least I would argue. In the process, so it's actively positioning itself against the US and really presenting an autocratic alternative in a region where, paternalistic government is rampant. And this is clearly resonating with local leaders who themselves are preempting or suppressing domestic calls for liberalizations and in some ways competing for China's attention. I'll stop here and we can pick up some of these issues in the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Patricia. I just wanted to reinforce one point that Patricia just made by inviting our audience, if they are more interested in Arab public opinion vis-a-vis external powers in the region, particularly the comparison how the Arab street looks at countries ranging from China to the US to EU countries to Iran. and to look at Arab Opinion Index on Arab website, arabcenterdc.org. Of course, and there are other public opinion surveys that have essentially proven the same point that Patricia just said with regards to how Arabs look at Chinese policy or Chinese role in the Middle East. We will move now to Abdullah Baabood, who's visiting professor and chair of the State of Qatar for Islamic Area Studies at the School of International Liberal Studies in Waseda University. And he will be focusing on China's role in the region, Gulf-China relations and agreements, particularly in the areas of oil and gas policy priorities, and how the policies of Middle East states at this time are evolving and adapting to this new, if we can call it multipolar global order or whatever, some new order definitely is emerging, and he will try to put that in context for us. Dr. Abdullah, please proceed.
Thank you, Dr. Khalil, and thank you for the kind invitation from the Arab Center to join you in this very important webinar and to join this really distinguished panel here. I believe that much of the points I wanted to talk about has already been alluded to by the excellent previous speakers, but let me try and scrape my head a little bit and come up with something a little bit different or new, perhaps. First of all, we have to remember that the Gulf states, Middle East in general, but the Gulf states in particular, have always been had good relationship with the West in general, and particularly the United States and Europe. The United States had guaranteed the security and still continues to do so of the region and of the smaller Gulf states. The trading relations were obviously because of colonial history, etc., was mainly with the West. Here, I'm talking about Europe and the United States in particular. But as time goes by, things started to change in many ways, as many of you obviously will know. One of them is, of course, the change in the center of gravity of economic activities. That has been moving over the years from west to east. And with it, obviously, this accounts for the activities and of trade relations and trade productivity in the world. So it's moved from the Atlantic, now it is in Asia. And obviously, the rise of Asian countries, not only China, but as Ambassador Freeman had mentioned, Japan, South Korea, ASEAN, and of course, India and other Asian countries as well. So there's been a rise of economic activities in Asia. And we don't forget that there has been also a change in the dynamics of global energy, where oil and gas have started to kind of move more towards the east because of the extra need for economic activities in Asia, and where the United States has started to find its own substitution, and that is, of course, shale oil and shale gas. And Europe has also started to look for alternative energy sources from North Africa, from other African countries, and from Russia, as it were. So for the smaller Gulf states that are reliant on their energy exports, they've got to find a market. And that market is now Asia, whether we like it or not, or whether the West like it or not. So basically, that is the most important thing that has happened in the global economy, and the shift in the global economy, and of course the energy geopolitics. And we have to remember that these Gulf states rely on the income of their energy exports for their economic development, but also for their own security. It is very important for them to ensure that they have good markets and they have stable markets and growing markets around the world. And of course, that is now Asia. And of course, they're going to have good relationship with whoever is going to buy their energy. And of course, given China needs, it puts it in a situation where they are the most favored country now for the Gulf monarchies in the region. So this is really kind of, the overall picture I was trying to make to explain why, as you correctly said, who's pivoting where. It's not that the United States is pivoting towards Asia, but also it's the Gulf states that are also pivoting towards Asia because of their economic needs. And it is also Asia, Asian countries, China in particular, is also pivoting east or west in this case, sorry, towards the Gulf states, because as to fuel its economy, Asia needs oil, needs energy, and that comes from the Middle East, from the Gulf, which is the closest, of course. Now we have Russia coming in because of the sanctions of the Ukraine war, etc., started to export and find a space there. But that's not the whole story. The other story that the Gulf states have had this relationship with the West per se, but there has been really very little to show for this relationship. It was like one-sided relationship where there were buyers and sellers, where Europe and the United States were buying oil and selling arms, but hardly making any impact on the socio-economic scene of the Gulf states. And the Gulf states are aware that oil days are ticking, and given the climate change and given the energy transition, they've got to diversify their economies, and they're looking for know-how, technology, investments, etc. And where is that coming from? It's now coming from China and from other Asian countries, because they have less conditions on their investments, whether it is the traditional investment in just infrastructure and buildings and so on, but even in technology and arms and ballistic missiles technology, etc. They are finding that China and other Asian countries are putting less conditions on them. And the other reason is that also they can identify more with Asia culturally. There's been historical linkages, but also they can identify with the Chinese regime. As I think Patricia had mentioned, that they see that they look at China as a model of how one party basically ruling the country, and it's not a democratic there's no democratic process as such, and they can see it as a model where they can also develop their own country based on this Chinese model. And the other thing is that China does not interfere, of course, I think both speakers mentioned this, in the internal politics of the region. So I think having just given this overall view of the environment where this relationship is being built, we see that this relationship has been warming up over the years, to the extent when President Xi Jinping visits Saudi Arabia, you can, I'm sure all the audience can contrast it with the visit that Biden made to Saudi Arabia. and to see the warmth and of the reception, etc. But also to see the number of agreements that were signed. Something like 40 different agreements were signed. Of course, one can say these are MOUs and they're not all going to be implemented, which is absolutely understood. But we are seeing some of them are actually being implemented, and there is a very strong intention from both sides to enlarge this relationship and make it even wider and bigger, etc. And of course, China has signed comprehensive, strategic comprehensive agreements with Saudi Arabia, with the United Arab Emirates, and other countries are negotiating that as well. My colleagues have mentioned the level of trade that is taking place. And of course, that is enormous to the extent that China has overtaken both Europe and the United States, where Europe used to be the largest trading partner until recently. And it has actually taken both of them combined. So, it shows you the level of trade, but also the level of investment, both ways. And which makes this relationship even more strategic. And of course, China is now investing or co-investing in the Gulf states, particularly in high-tech industries and ballistic missile technology, where the Gulf states are trying to develop their own indigenous arms production. And China is supporting that, where the United States has been reluctant, and other Western countries to a certain extent have put on a lot of conditions. China plays very well in actually creating a strategic diffusion of narratives and makes this very important to show to the Gulf states that, look, we are your friends here. Look at what the United States is saying. Look what the other Western powers are saying. But and basically it sits there watching the faults and the mistakes that has been made by the United States policies in the region, and cleverly, strategically pointing them out to the public, to the government, and it's gaining resonance actually in the region. So this is something that needs to be taken into consideration. And I will end, if you like, Khalil, by saying that the relationship is not just economics and energy and of course investments, but it has moved to more political, as been mentioned by previous panelists, that China played a very important role in brokering this deal, but also in other areas that it is involving. But I think it's also moving beyond that, with this idea of the ports that China is now trying to invest in and to control, etc., using the Gulf and the Middle East location as an advantageous position to trade with, of course, with Africa, with the region, of course, first of all, but then with Africa and Europe. So Chinese, string of pearls diplomacy, as it were, is playing a very important role in getting China involved more politically and strategically in the region. So I think as time goes by, China doesn't want to get involved in regional politics. It doesn't. It is playing a very, very astute and clever game of staying away from regional conflicts and from confronting the United States. But as time goes by, and energy security becomes very important for it, I don't think it will leave the region without having to, invest in securing the region. And I think the way forward is to work with China, not only with the Middle Eastern countries and the Gulf states, but also for international powers like the United States, and to accept that China is now a major player, a global player that needs to be taken into consideration, and its interest has to be taken into consideration. And also we need to take into consideration that the Gulf states and smaller Gulf states, the Middle Eastern states in general, find space now to maneuver in this, whatever one want to call it, world that is evolving, that we haven't seen the birth of, but it is something in the offing. So they find the space to maneuver. So this is a great moment for them where they can strategically hedge their bets and play off, global powers to their own advantage. And I think it's, it could be a win-win for everyone if the game was accepted that this is going to be the way it is in the future. And I'll stop here, Dr. Khalil. Thank you.
Thank you, Abdullah. We all wish that it will be a win-win for all. Let's go to our next speaker, Maria Papageorgiou, who's Associate Lecturer in Qualitative Research Methods at UCL, University College of London. And she has recently written on several related aspects of our discussion today, including on the relationship or the interaction between America, Russia, and the post-Cold emerging kind of post-Cold War stalemate that is emerging in the region. The microphone is yours, Maria, go ahead.
Thank you very much for the invitation. For today, I'm just gonna touch upon a few elements in regards to China's engagement, military engagement in the Middle East, what this has to do with its grand strategy overall, and also what it means for its vision for a multipolar world order. So it is quite evident that in the last 10 years, Beijing has tried to establish itself as a great power. And particularly due to this emerging and very evident competition with United States over the last years, we can see that it is trying to project its military power. It has enhanced its efforts, for example, to become a major arms exporter in different parts of the world. It has increased its military exercises with different countries around the world, and also has initiated joint production projects. So given the industrial capabilities of the Chinese arms industry, I would like to provide some data along the way. We can see that China has managed to surpass Russia and has become, for example, the second largest munition producer in the world, and having 3 Chinese companies in the top 10. At the same time, when it comes to arms export, China is the 4th or 5th biggest exporters of armed weapons in the world, depending, of course, on the year. And it has exported now arms to 53 countries. And even though these are third world countries primarily, in which China is the largest exporter, it shows this highest inclination of China to project its military power. Now, when it comes to the Chinese weapons, these are coming at a lower cost compared to their competitors. They offer more affordable services. And particularly what it found many third countries find very much attractive, it's the upgrade packages that the Chinese arms weapons offer. However, China has been a rather latecomer when it comes to arms exports, when it comes to arms race, even in different regions, and particularly in the Middle East, that it is the second region in the world that absorbed most military exports from different countries around the world. So China is a latecomer, that it started even engaged in the Middle East during the Iran-Iraq war in the early 80s. It hasn't managed to live up to this expectation of becoming a major arms exporter in the region. So we can see that even when it starts supplying weapons to Iran and Iraq during the war in the early 80s, which is the highest arms export of China in the region up to today, it has not managed to compete with, for example, US and Russia, and particularly in the Middle East, that it was considered during the Cold War a zone of superpower competition, for instance. Now, when it comes to China's arms in particular, they are based on three principles that China has adopted, and they have rather remained consistent throughout the years. The first one is that it has to strengthen the legitimate self-defense capabilities of the recipient states to promote, of course, peace and stability, and also, and most importantly, to not interfere with the internal affairs of the recipient countries. That has made it a very attractive choice for many countries, and particularly in the Middle East. At the same time, China has managed to avoid taking sides when it comes to regional conflicts, and even has supplied weapons to adversaries. So it has adopted what we call a blanket style by exporting various types of weapons to different countries. And Middle East has become a particularly important region for China, not only because it's the second biggest market in the world, but also because it can show its influence as a great military power. Throughout the years, and except from this peak in the early 80s, in the 90s and the 2000s, the engagement in the Middle East was rather sporadic and limited. However, after the inauguration of the Belt and Road Initiative, China signed a significant amount of strategic partnerships with almost all the countries in the Middle East, that they included the reference to enhanced military cooperation. This is a very important element, that it was also featured in the China's 2016 Arab policy. So military cooperation in the region, it's very important for China's grand strategy and its involvement in the region. Now, for specific weapons, China is supplying the region primarily with UAVs, unmanned aerial vehicles, the drones, particularly due to US reluctance to do so. And it offered itself as an alternative. So it has gained a niche expertise in the region when it comes to drones. For instance, I would like to mention some data here. In the period between 2017 and 2021, China's export of UAVs to Saudi Arabia, they were increased by 290%, and in the United Arab Emirates, 77%. However, still they were up to 5% of the total imports of these two countries. So the main sales of China's weapons to the region are the CH-4, the Winglong 1 and the Winglong 2 drones when it comes to drones, and the Dongfeng ballistic missile. Now, a very important development it has been when it comes to arms transfer, the expiration of the UN embargo to Iran. This has also propelled these two countries to try to engage in modernizing Iran's military industrial base, but also it has propelled Iran to discuss agreements with China in order to acquire fighter aircrafts and battle tanks in particular. However, when we see holistically, when it comes to arms transfers of China in the Middle East, it's still not yet a significant arm exporter. It's lagging significantly behind the US and also Russia. It is ranking 5th or 6th in the region compared to other countries, and is not in the top 3 in terms of arm importers in any of the Middle Eastern countries. And particularly for the period between 2010 and 2022, China contributed less than 2% in the GCC states and 2.5% in the Middle East in general. However, in order for China to expand its military power projection in the region, it has not only tried to engage when it comes to arms transfer, but also by conducting military exercises, promoting military exchanges, advancing port calls, having official military visits, and very importantly, joint military production. So when it comes to naval escorts in the Gulf of Eden, 2010 in the Strait of Hormuz, we had the first port visit to Zayed Port in Abu Dhabi. And very interestingly, after the Belt and Road Initiative, in 2014, China deployed submarines to patrol the Eastern Indian Ocean to show the importance of the regions to China's strategic interest. In 2019, China engaged in a number of bilateral exercises with certain countries in the region. So we had the Blue Sword exercise with Saudi Arabia. We had, for example, a naval exercise with Egypt. And also we had the establishment of the trilateral exercise, the Maritime Security Belt between China, Iran, and Russia. And this annual exercise was also repeated in 2023. A very interesting development is that although these exercises so far, they had a naval and maritime component, they were focusing mostly on anti-piracy measures and confidence building measure between the countries. A very recent that is going to take place this month, an Air Force exercise between China and the United Arab Emirates is going to take place in Xinjiang. This is a very important development, not only because of the location that this exercise is going to take place, but also because of the different scope, but also because it involves Air Force deployment between the two countries. Now, a few things I wanted to mention just about the joint military production, and that particularly in years that China has tried to engage more closely with its Middle Eastern partners. For example, it has established a research and development initiative with United Arab Emirates through the CES. In 2017, it signed a memorandum of understanding with Saudi Arabia to assemble and distribute locally the CH-4. And this agreement was further expanded in 2022 in order to be able to manufacture UAVs in Saudi Arabia. And another very interesting development that happened also in 2022 has been the Chinese presence in the Abu Dhabi 2022 AMEX. The Chinese offered the biggest exhibition with over 500 pieces, and they presented for the first time the micro drone, the Fengniao, and also the L-15 trainer jets, which was also very important due to the selection of the region they decided to do so. Now, to start concluding, I would just like to highlight what are the China's motivation in its military engagement in the region, which are multifold. First of all, they are economic. China wants to find new markets for its arms export. It wants to move itself from low-tech exports to high-tech and advanced-tech exports and establish itself as an important exporter in the region. Also, it wants to secure its trade routes and also its supply chain through the 21st century maritime Silk Road. And also, given its energy dependence by certain actors in the region, it also wants to be part of the diplomatic decisions in order to secure a stable environment, but also to monitor the prices when it comes to energy. At the same time, China has certain status consideration. It wants to establish itself as a great power, and it understands that the military power is of great importance. It wants to show that it can project power in other parts of the world and that it can be a significant player when it comes to the security dynamics of its region. And of course, it wants to show that it can counter US and Western influence in the region, particularly this fostering the agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran. It showed that it can be an important diplomatic or political actor in the region. So overall, we can say that China's engagement in the region can be characterized by a soft military presence. It uses all these elements of arms sales, joint military exercises, visits between officials, for example, and joint production more as a tool of influence to gain access to political and military elites in order to be able to be part of the regional decisions. However, it has not positioned itself that it can be a security provider for the countries in the region. And it doesn't seem willing to do so because it has been benefited by US predominance and the military bases in the region in order to be able to establish itself in a more economic terms and focus on its economic advancements and more recently its technological advancements, because we can see that by promoting Huawei networks in the regions, it also limits the country's collaboration with Western countries due to intelligence sharing and security issues that they are arising by using Huawei in their networks. And I would like to conclude with some implications when it comes to Europe and what this China's engagement.
You have one minute, Maria,
yeah,
if you don't mind.
Yes, I just wanted to mention that other countries, for example, European countries like UK, France, and Germany and Italy, that they are significant arms exporter in the regions. They don't see very, let's say, happily China taking a bigger share from the arms exports in the region. And also they saw an opportunity given Russia's war in the Ukraine and its poor performance to get a bigger share from Russia. So they don't want to see a bigger competition with China. Also, they want to secure the issues when it comes to energy security and also immigration flows in because of their proximity with the Middle East. So they are monitoring China's growing influence in the region. So I'm going to stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maria, for your excellent presentation. Our fifth speaker is Jennifer Kavanagh, Senior Fellow, American Statecraft Program at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And she will be talking about implications for U.S. policy and influence in the MENA region with regards to all what we have discussed. I would like to also mention that she's the co-author with Frederick Weary of a recent article that definitely fits our discussion today. The title of it was The Multi-Aligned Middle East, How America Should Adapt to China's Growing Influence in the region. If you haven't read that, please do that. It's an excellent article. Jennifer, the microphone is yours. Please go ahead.
Great. Thank you so much for having me today. I'm really honored to be a part of this really great panel. So I'm going to focus on the sort of U.S. perspective. And I want to start by just making the point that there's very little evidence that the United States has pivoted away from the Middle East in any real sense. If you look at some of the data, especially in the security domain, its security presence remains significant. It's certainly not the same as it was at the height of the Iraq War. But if you look at levels, troop levels and levels of security assistance, it's similar to what it was just prior to that. So there's over 30,000 US troops in the region. US security assistance in the region is back at its 2003 level and includes some of the biggest recipients of US security assistance are in the Middle East, Israel, Saudi Arabia, UAE. And the US has dozens of, at least a dozen military installations and many more prepositioned sites where they keep equipment, and they conduct tons of military exercises in the region as well. Their arms sales have actually increased as a percentage of the total. Khalil mentioned at the beginning, it's about 54%, and they've benefited from sanctions on Russia. So as countries have stopped buying Russian equipment due to US sanctions, the US has benefited from that. Just in the past few months, the US presence in the region has actually increased rather than decreasing. The US has just recently sent F-35s, F-16s, and A-10s to the region. They've deployed an increased naval presence and increased the number of naval patrols. They've conducted additional military exercises with allies and partners. And now there's obviously this plan in the works to potentially put Marines on commercial ships to prevent seizure by Iran. So if you look at the big picture here, the US security presence is definitely not decreasing. And we can talk maybe if we have time at the end about whether that's a good or bad thing. But I want to kind of dispel that myth up front. In the economic realm, it's certainly true that the US is no longer the leading trade partner, but that's been true for some time. I think it's more significant that China's passed Europe, which is something that happened much more recently, which one of my co-panelists pointed to. The United States is still the leading source of investment in the region. by a significant margin, although China has obviously increased its presence in that area as well with the Belt and Road, as Patricia discussed. The US is also not absent diplomatically. Ambassador Freeman talked a little bit about the Abraham Accords, which I'll come back to in a minute, but the United States is still trying to play this diplomatic role. So while the US presence is still very robust, China's presence has obviously increased. And since I want to make sure we leave time for questions, I won't go into the details, just to say that I think I agree with Maria's points that China's expansion economically and militarily has not been in any way to replace the role that the United States plays. China has no interest in serving as a security guarantor for any country in the Middle East. So the US should feel secure that it has that role if it wants to continue to play it. Instead, China has expanded where the US has left gaps. So they're providing drones and certain types of missiles that the US has refused to sell. They're doing co-production deals that the US has refused to participate in. They're providing investment to countries without strings attached in ways that the US and US firms have not been willing to. I would say the biggest, in terms of the military space, the biggest places where China has expanded that are worth watching are the ports, which Abdullah mentioned. Those ports, when China contributes and participates in building them, they're often required to provide services to PLA forces that are in the region. So it allows for this projection of military power. And second, their participation and support to internal security in these countries, training and surveillance equipment for law enforcement. That's another thing the US doesn't tend to do, where China has been expanding. And as been mentioned many times, they're an increasingly important diplomatic player in the region because they haven't alienated anyone. They're able to work with anyone, and that gives them an important role potentially as a mediator. But I would say the biggest change in the region hasn't been necessarily the increase in China's role or any change, as I mentioned, in the US role, but goes back to something that Ambassador Freeman mentioned in his remarks. The biggest change, in my view, is the region's changing alignment and its desire for having a diverse set of patrons. This is what I would call, and what Fred Weary and I called in the article, multi-alignment. So I would argue that the region isn't really all that multipolar. It's still dominated by the United States in security domain and maybe China in the economic domain. It doesn't seem multipolar to me, but it is multi-aligned in the sense that countries in the region don't want to be partners with one country. They want to be partners with many. They want to be partners with China and Russia and India and Australia and Brazil. They're looking for diversity to pursue their interests. Now, this poses a significant challenge for the United States because it is exactly counter to the way the United States has operated in the Middle East and globally. The US likes to build security-focused, exclusive blocs. It likes its partners to work only with the United States, and it tends to focus narrowly on security issues. And you can see this across regions, and especially in the Middle East. The current administration continues to cling to this idea and this set of policies. You can see that in how they respond when Saudi Arabia and UAE buy non-US arms. And I would argue you can see it in the way they're approaching the Abraham Accords. To me, the push for Saudi-Israeli normalization and the even consideration of offering security guarantees and nuclear technology to Saudi Arabia is driven by this idea that if we can get that agreement signed, the United States then would have what's approaching a sort of security bloc against Iran and against Chinese influence. So it's driven by this desire to recreate the security blocs of the Cold War. The problem is that number one, this approach hasn't worked. See the Iraq War for if you need evidence, or the instability that's lasted for decades in the Middle East because of failed US policies. And number two, because countries in the region don't want that anymore. They want multi-alignment. They don't want a security partner of choice, which is what the US strives to be. They want many security partners. And in this sense, China's approach is actually better. They have a more fluid, flexible approach. They're willing to have partners that are non-exclusive. and they're more comfortable working in these shifting coalitions. So the US is actually at a disadvantage. So what does it suggest for US policy? I'll just make a couple of points wrapping up. The first is that I think it's essential that the United States recognize that this era of exclusive partnerships and security blocs is over, and has to push towards a policy that's more comfortable working across shifting coalitions. And this has two main components. The first is the United States has to be comfortable and should welcome China's contributions to stability in the Middle East. As my co-panelists have mentioned, China's role has been beneficial in a number of ways. And this also means, though, that the United States should avoid taking steps that compromise US interests or US values just to deny China. So there's no reason to sell US arms to human rights abusers just to prevent China from selling those arms. There's no reason to compromise existing processes or to allow to not push for conditionality of US weapons and US aid on things like good governance and transparency and economic security. Doesn't have to be democracy promotion, there's like problems with that potentially, but pushing for some of these principles. It's true that China won't do this, but just China, these countries are going to build ties with China whether or not the US sticks to its principles or not. So I don't see a lot of advantage to compromising those principles in ways that damage US interests more globally. And the second is the US should really lean into this concept of multi-alignment. It can be an advantage for the US if the US learns how to work with it. And I think there's two main pathways. The first is to become more comfortable building non-exclusive partnerships itself and to move away from the obsession with security-focused agreements. I don't see much hope in the near term of new free trade agreements from the US, although I agree with Ambassador Freeman, that's a big gap. But there's still things the US could do to build coalitions around things like where the US has comparative advantage, green technology, bridging the digital divide, human capital advancement, governance reform. These are things where the US could really provide value and should be more engaged. And the second is to act as a broker. If these countries in the Middle East want to be partners with many different, to have many different patrons, there's lots of countries that the US is partners with in other regions, Australia, India, countries in Europe, countries in South America, that might make good partners. And the US could act as a broker to help form some of these interregional coalitions, maybe modeled after the I2U2, which I think is an interesting arrangement. And this would help to diversify partnerships, to bring new investment into the region, to provide the US new pathways to engage and maybe revitalize or reframe its influence, and also to help diffuse this US-China axis, which seems to be very damaging, in my view, to progress in the region on many different fronts. These don't have to be anti-China. China could be involved in some of them if they're overlapping interests. And some might include the US and some might not. And that moves you away from this whole block-based mentality. So to me, those seem like policies that if the US could move in that direction, it would be beneficial both for US influence in the region, US interests more broadly, and hopefully for the region as well.
Thank you, Jennifer. Great presentation, and appreciate the challenging, if you will, recommendations, policy recommendations that you have made, and I hope officials are listening. So thanks again. We have a lot of questions, so we're going to go ahead and spend the balance of our time in the art of conversation with our audience. The first question, I will address the question to an individual panelist, but feel free to chime in if you would like to, but just make your answers short because of the limited time, 2 to 3 minutes max. The first question is from Ziad Bubakar. Essentially, can someone help us, help me and the Arab Street in general understand the US security? What is meant by that? What is the US protecting us from? Abdullah?
The question is to me, Khalil, and that's a difficult question.
It is.
When it comes to the Gulf, I think, and here I'll talk about the Gulf, I think the worry is, of course, for these Gulf monarchies is that Iran, was trying to export the revolution after the Islamic Revolution in Iran, and of course there are also other other threats that were coming from uncontrolled, what some would call, terrorist groups, etc., that were threatening the stabilities of the Gulf monarchies. So I think that was like the perception that the United States is securing the region and helping security of the region against these external threats. But I think it is more than that. I think it's also, to ensure that the United States is, says that the primary security or partner that benefits also from in the region, and also secure the regimes of its, that are its friends, of course, in the region. But if allow me just one thing, and that is the United States has been calling for something called burden sharing. And it's been saying that, we've been securing the region for too long, and the United States, and China and other Asian countries were benefiting from the region. Why they are not sharing in the security of the region? And they call them, free riders. Now that other powers like China is trying to move in and so on, it is seen as a threat. So I think we need also to redefine that, what is meant by burden sharing, and who's a free rider, and why not give China, which is now more reliant on energy from the region than any other parts of the world, to share also in the security of the region, instead of trying to push it away and not to work with it. So I'll stop here, if you like.
Yeah, thank you, Abdullah. If I may take advantage of being moderator here and plug the work of Arab Center a little bit more. Public opinion surveys that we have conducted over the past 10 years are consistent in terms of what Ziad is asking about, in the sense, the question that we continue to ask: do you think the policies of some international powers threaten regional security and stability? And it's kind of interesting. The last one we did is a couple years old now, 2020. But on that list, Arab public opinion is, very clear. It essentially considers the number one threat. 84% of Arabs think Israel is the number one threat to the national security of the region. 78% think U.S. policy is a threat, particularly in terms of its bias to Israeli policies, I guess. 56% compared to that think Iran is the threat, because that's usually, protecting against Iran and its cronies tends to be the most used kind of excuse in the media, particularly. By the way, China is only viewed as a national security threat by 37% of Arabs. This is a survey done by interviewing 33,000 people in 12 Arab countries, including some Gulf countries. So it is kind of the discrepancy between how the West views the threats and how the Arab street views it is massive. Ambassador Freeman, there's a question from Tivania Chichak saying, do you think that Asia will become more dependent on renewable energy? If so, how will this impact the presence of Asia and the US in the Middle East? Do you suspect that as oil becomes less desirable, if it does, in comparison to sustainable energy economies in the Middle East, especially Saudi Arabia, will struggle in terms of meeting budgets?
I don't expect the oil market to disappear anytime soon in China or anywhere else. However, the Chinese are the global leaders in the development of renewable energy, whether it's solar or wind or nuclear. at the moment, by far the largest investment. Just dwarfs anything that anyone else is doing. And the Chinese plan is to phase out coal as we approach 2030 and to replace it with more renewable energy. I don't think that's going to reduce the demand for oil, which is useful for transportation purposes, even though China is the leader in electric vehicle technology and production, by far the largest producer now of automobiles and the world's largest automobile market, but not automobiles that burn fossil fuels. I want to, if I may, just comment briefly on the military dimension. I thought the comments of the panelists were excellent, but there was one thing that was omitted, and that is far from seeing the U.S. Navy's traditional role as the protector of freedom of navigation in the Persian Gulf as a plus or as a constant. China now sees the U.S. Navy as the major threat to its supply chains and supply lines to the Middle East. And this tells me that, as Patricia mentioned, and Maria as well, in due course, the Chinese Navy is going to have to undertake its own protection role for those lines of communication. So they're going to turn up. This brings me to a final point, which Jennifer mentioned, and that is that the United States really has to adapt to what I think she very correctly called multi-alignment of countries in the region. But it also has to adapt to the fact that the region's trade is now mainly with South Asia, India, and China, and Japan, Korea, and so forth, countries to the, and Indonesia, countries to the south and east. No security arrangement for the Gulf can work if it omits China and India, in my view. And therefore, by definition, whatever replaces American unilateralism has to be Asian-based, and it has to include these countries, whatever the state of their relations with the United States may be.
Thank you, Chaz. We have a question from Robert Stiver. Patricia, would you like to comment on the role of China with regards to the situation in Syria and Arab normalization of relationships with the regime, and how is Chinese activity in Syria apt to expand in terms of, particularly if we move toward reconstruction?
Thank you, Khalil. I mean, what I can say is, China, I mean, one of the consequences of the Saudi-Iranian deal has been, to bring Syria in some ways from the cold and really restore relations and bring it into the Arab League. I think from the China side, it's trying to build its credibility as a capable partner, adopting this kind of approach of negotiated settlements, which are having its appeal. And of course, the local realities will eventually dictate the outcomes and the success of these efforts. And I think China from the beginning had declared that it welcomed improved relations between Syria and the Arab world. It also declared previously, not surprisingly, that it supports safeguarding sovereignty and territorial integrity, et cetera, and of course, Assad welcomes the possibility of Chinese investment, in particular, in the war-torn country, even though I would say that China is probably cautious given the instability and the possible limited return on investment, that this would bring. So I do think ultimately, this all is about, the bigger context, of the Saudi-Iranian deal. But I think, in terms of returns, they are likely to be limited. For now.
This next question from Jerome Glenn has been alluded to by several of the speakers, but I'm going to ask it again. Are there any possible synergetic relations between the US and China in the Middle East? Maria, would you like to begin tackling this? I know Jennifer mentioned it also. Jennifer, feel free to comment on that. What are the possibilities, if you will, for synergetic relations between the two in the region?
I think I can just comment on what it is happening or what it has happened so far, and we don't see actually synergetic initiatives, and we see that the two countries are moving towards opposing directions. So, for example, this growing engagement, and for example, if a possible free trade agreement is going to be concluded between China, for example, and the GCC, as it was discussed during the summit, it will create further issues in the relationship of United States with its Middle Eastern partners. Also, we need to mention that some of the Middle Eastern countries, for example, Iran is a permanent member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and United Arab Emirates are now dialogue partners. So they are trying to diversify and to proclaim their strategic autonomy in the region. So I think we are moving towards opposing spheres of influence and opposing diplomatic initiatives. So for the time being, and given this very conflictious environment between United States and China in the Indo-Pacific, for example, in the Asia-Pacific, I think this will have spillover effects in other regions. So I wouldn't see any synergetic initiatives in the short term, at least.
Thank you, Maria. Jennifer, the issue of, in terms of analysis of the Chinese role in the region, everybody seems to comment on the fact that China is clearly competing with the US in the Middle East. To what extent that competition is threatening to the US role, that's of course subject to discussion. But is China simply trying to advance its own interests in the region, or is it really trying to replace the US?
I mean, so my view is that China is not necessarily trying to replace the United States, and that it really does not have, at least in the Middle East, it doesn't really have the capabilities to do so yet. And for a long time, it may be aiming to be able to project military power, but it's a long way from being able to project useful military power to the Middle East. So in a lot of ways, what China's doing globally is just what any power would do to protect its interests, and as it became, and as it pursued great power status. Even the pursuit of military bases is something that is seen as very nefarious. But the US has military bases all around the world, which it has developed to project its power, to protect its economic interests, to protect its security interests, to build partnerships. So I think that there are two narratives. One narrative applies to the way the US acts in the world, and one that applies to the way China acts in the world, and they are not always sort of equally balanced. That doesn't mean that everything that China does is necessarily that nothing China does is threatening to US interests, or that we should accept all Chinese actions as benevolent. But I do think that the narrative in DC about US-China competition has become harmful because it has become so polarized and so single-tracked in terms of seeing everything that Beijing does as a threat to the United States. And that then leads us down a bad policy road, because it leads us down a policy road in which the US policy is driven not by US interests, but by responding to the latest thing that China has done. And in the Middle East, that's very harmful because US policy is already struggling in the Middle East. And so if it becomes reactive in that way rather than strategic, I think that sets us down a bad path for the US and a bad path for the region. And I would agree with Maria, this is the last thing I'll say, that I would agree with Maria that there are no real synergistic activities now, but I think there are some areas of possible overlap. I mean, climate is put out there a lot. I think it's a good one. Mm-hmm. We don't seem to be able to make any progress on it, but it's a good one. Another would be economic diversification in the region. Mm-hmm. These countries would do well to diversify their economies away from energy. And that's something that China and the United States could work together on, it seems to me. Human capital advancement and bridging the digital divide. That gets a little tricky because obviously there's competing concerns about whose system to use, but those are areas where both countries have interests and capabilities. So I do see there as being potential if we could get away from this idea that that the two countries are diametrically opposed on every issue in all domains and regions.
Thank you, Jennifer. This last question came from Dan Lieberman. Thanks, Dan, for your question. I forgot to mention that when I read the question. Special thanks to all our panelists today, Ambassador Freeman, Patricia Karam, Abdullah Baabood, Jennifer, Maria. Thank you all for your great presentations. I know I have a better understanding of the challenge faced with regards to this issue, Chinese role in the region as a result of your remarks today and your answers to these questions. Thank you to the hundreds of people who registered for this program and those who attended it. Thank you to the people who sent us some questions. And we invite you to reconnect again or stay connected to Arab Center. We remain engaged with you, and we hope that you will also reciprocate and remain engaged with the center with regards to topics of national interest like this one. Thanks, everybody. Good day.